This won't stop me. We have to move now. There's no time to wait.
Some voices are meant to be heard. Others are trained to disappear into the background, translating worlds while remaining unseen. But what happens when the most invisible voice becomes the only one that matters? The desert sun beat down mercilessly on forward operating base Sentinel. Dust devils danced across the compound as soldiers moved with practiced efficiency between operations tents and armored vehicles. Among them walked a woman who seemed to exist in the spaces between notice and recognition. Lieutenant. Sarah Chen carried a worn leather satchel over her shoulder, her uniform bearing no combat badges, no medals that caught the eye. Just a simple name tape and a translator's insignia that most soldiers glossed over without a second thought. She had learned long ago that being overlooked was part of the job description. She approached the briefing tent, where Captain Marcus Hawthorne stood, surrounded by his unit commanders. They were arguing over maps, voices raised, fingers jabbing at coordinates. Sarah waited at the edge of their circle, patient as always. "We need reliable intel on their positions," Hawthorne said, frustration evident in his voice. "The local contacts aren't giving us anything useful." "Nah," Sarah said quietly. No one turned. "The dialect they're speaking," she continued, slightly louder, "it's not the regional standard. They're from the northern provinces. Different trust protocols?" Hawthorne glanced at her briefly, then back to his commanders. "We've tried every approach." "Not every approach," Sarah replied. "You've been using formal military Arabic. 2 northern tribe members, that sounds like government officials. They've learned to distrust that tone." One of the commanders, Lieutenant Brooks, scoffed. "And you think using different words will magically make them cooperate?" Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Language isn't just words, Lieutenant. It's identity, culture, family history. When you speak to someone in the language of their oppressors, you become the oppressor." The tent fell silent for a moment. Hawthorne studied her with new attention. "What would you suggest?" "Let me meet with them," Sarah said. "Alone, no uniforms standing behind me like enforcers. Just conversation." Brooks laughed. "You want us to send our translator out unprotected to chat with potential hostiles? That's not protocol." "Protocol has gotten us nowhere," Sarah countered. "And I'm not just a translator. I'm a linguist. I speak 17 languages and 43 dialects. I've studied cultural anthropology and negotiation theory. But more importantly, I listen." Where Hawthorne considered this. Around him, his commanders shifted uncomfortably. Sending a non-combat officer out alone went against every instinct they had. "You understand the risk?" Hawthorne asked. "I understand that words can be more powerful than weapons," Sarah replied. When wielded correctly. 3 hours later, Sarah sat cross-legged in a small village elder's home, 20 miles from base. No armor, no weapon, just her voice and her understanding. The elder, a man named Rashid, poured tea with hands weathered by decades of desert living. He spoke in rapid northern dialect, testing her. Sarah responded fluidly, her accent shifting to match his regional pronunciation. She asked about his grandchildren by name information she'd memorized from cultural briefings. She referenced farming techniques specific to his province. She laughed at the right moments, showed respect in the way she held her teacup, understood the significance of the small gestures that transcended words. Rashid's suspicious expression slowly softened. "You are not like the others," he said finally. In English, surprising her? No, Sarah agreed. "Switching languages without missing a beat. I'm here to build bridges, not walls." "There are men," Rashid said carefully, "who come through these lands. They speak of violence. They recruit young people with promises of purpose." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "We want to protect those young people. But we can't if we don't understand where the danger is coming from." Rashid was quiet for a long moment. Then he began to speak. When Sarah returned to base 3 hours later, she carried intelligence that would change everything. Locations, supply routes, leadership structures. Information that had eluded military operations for months. Hawthorne stared at the detailed notes she'd written. "How did you get all this?" "I listened," Sarah said simply, "and I spoke in a voice that didn't sound like an enemy." Brooks stood nearby, his earlier skepticism replaced with grudging respect. "I underestimated you. Most people do," Sarah replied without bitterness. It was simply a fact of her existence. As she walked back to her quarters that evening, Sarah passed groups of soldiers who barely noticed her. She heard fragments of their conversations. Complaints about the heat, jokes about the food, speculation about upcoming operations. She was invisible again. But somewhere in the intelligence networks, her information was being processed, analyzed, acted upon. Somewhere, decisions were being made based on words she'd gathered. Bridges she'd built with nothing but language and understanding. The next morning would bring new challenges. A situation that would test everything she'd learned. A moment when being invisible would no longer be an option. Because sometimes, the quietest voice must become the loudest. And sometimes, surrender comes not from superior firepower, but from superior understanding. The radio crackled at 0400 hours. Turning a quiet dawn into chaos, code red. Hostile force has breached Sector 7. They're heavily armed and advancing on the civilian village of Alkmaar. Sarah jerked awake in her bunk, heart pounding.
Alkmaar.
That was where Rashid lived, where families she'd met with children whose names she knew resided in fragile peace. She dressed rapidly and ran toward the operations center. Inside, organized chaos reigned. Hawthorne stood at the tactical display, his face grim. 30 hostiles, maybe more, a lieutenant reported. They've taken positions in the village. We have confirmation of civilian hostages. Rules of engagement, someone asked. Hold fire unless fired upon, Hawthorne ordered. But get the QRF mobilized. We're not losing that village. Sarah pushed through to the front. Captain, let me help. Hawthorne barely glanced at her. This is a combat situation, Lieutenant. We need soldiers, not translators. Those villagers know me, Sarah insisted. I can establish communication. Brooks interrupted. These aren't confused locals, Chen. These are trained fighters who've taken hostages. They don't want to talk. Everyone wants something, Sarah countered. We just need to find out what. Before Hawthorne could respond, another report came through. Sir, the hostile leader is demanding to speak with American command. He's threatening to execute hostages if we advance. The room tensed. This changed everything. Hawthorne's jaw tightened. Open a channel. A harsh voice filled the operations center, speaking aggressive Arabic, punctuated with threats. The base translator, a young corporal, struggled to keep up with the rapid-fire dialect, says. He wants recognition. No, wait, he's demanding. I think he's saying they won't surrender unless. The translation was choppy, missing nuances. Sarah could hear it clearly. The corporal didn't understand the northern tribal dialect. It was mixing formal and colloquial terms. Creating confusion, Captain Sarah said urgently. He's not just making demands. He's reciting poetry. What? Ancient war poetry from his tribal tradition. It's a ritual challenge. He's establishing his honor before negotiation. If we respond with military language, we're rejecting the framework of honor-based dialogue. We'll push him toward violence. Hawthorne looked at her sharply. You're sure? I'm certain. A beat of hesitation. Then Hawthorne nodded. You have the mic. Sarah moved to the communication station, her hands steady despite her racing heart. She closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself, then spoke. Her voice flowed through the radio in flawless northern dialect. But more than that, she responded with poetry of her own, traditional verses of peace, honor, and wisdom that matched his cultural framework. The hostile leader stopped mid-threat. Who speaks? He demanded. Someone who understands the old ways, Sarah replied. Someone who knows that true strength lies not in spilled blood, but in protected honor. The operations center was dead silent, every eye fixed on Sarah as she continued speaking. her voice calm but resonant with authority that transcended military rank. She referenced tribal codes, invoked respected elders, spoke of the protection due to those who offer hospitality, a sacred value in his culture. She didn't beg or threaten. She engaged him as an equal in the language of his ancestors. Minutes stretched into an hour. Back and forth they spoke, not as enemies, but as to people navigating complex webs of culture, honor, and human need. "You speak as one who has sat with the elders," the leader said finally, suspicion mixing with curiosity. "I have broken bread in Alkmaar," Sarah replied. "I know Rashid, son of Ahmad. I know the children who play by the well. I know these are people, not pawns." Another long pause. "You are military," he said. "You serve those who bring destruction." "I serve those who seek peace," Sarah countered. "But peace requires both sides to see each other as human. You have a voice. I am listening. Let me prove that someone hears you. What can you offer?" Sarah looked at Hawthorne. He nodded, slightly trussed, given in a moment of crisis. "Safe passage for dialogue," Sarah said. "A meeting with tribal elders? A chance to speak your grievances without weapons between us. This is not surrender. This is courage." The radio went silent for 3 long minutes. Then the woman with the poet's voice. "She may approach. Alone. Unarmed." The operations center erupted in protests. "Absolutely not," Brooks said immediately. "It's a trap," another officer added. But Hawthorne was looking at Sarah with an expression she'd never seen before, complete. "Unwavering respect? Your call, Lieutenant," he said quietly. Sarah didn't hesitate. "I'm going." 20 minutes later, she walked across open ground toward the village. The morning sun rising behind her, casting her shadow long across the sand. Every sniper scope in the base was trained on the hostile positions, but she walked alone, unarmed. Carrying only her voice and her conviction, the soldiers watched her go. This woman they'd overlooked, this translator they'd dismissed, walking into danger with nothing but words as her shield, and in that moment, every single one of them understood they had been wrong. The village square was silent as Sarah entered. Her footsteps the only sound against packed earth. Hostile fighters lined the buildings, weapons ready, eyes hard. But she didn't look at the guns. She looked at the faces. She saw fear beneath the aggression, desperation beneath the bravado. Young men who'd been told their only value lay in violence, their only voice in weapons. The leader emerged from Rashid's home, the same place where Sarah had drunk tea just days before. He was younger than she expected, perhaps 25, with eyes that had seen too much. "You came," he said, surprise evident despite his attempt at control. "You invited me," Sarah replied simply. He studied her for a long moment. "You are not afraid." "I am terrified," Sarah said honestly. "But fear doesn't mean we stop trying to understand each other." Something shifted in his expression. He hadn't expected truth. They sat on the ground in the village center, no table, no formal setting, just 2 people in the dust and morning light. Behind windows, Sarah could see the faces of hostages, including Rashid, watching with desperate hope. "Why do you fight?" Sarah asked. The leader's jaw tightened. "Because no one listens when we speak with peace." "I'm listening now," she did. For 2 hours, Sarah sat and listened as this young man, his name was Kareem, told his story. A village destroyed by crossfire, neither side claimed. A sister killed by a bomb meant for someone else. A voice silenced by powers that saw people as collateral, not as human beings with names and dreams and families. Sarah didn't make excuses, didn't justify, didn't minimize his pain. She witnessed it. "I cannot change what happened," she said finally. "I cannot bring back those you lost, but I can promise that today, in this moment, you are heard. Your pain is real. Your anger is valid, and there is another path forward." "Words," Kareem said bitterly. "What are words against guns?" "Words built every civilization," Sarah replied. "Words created laws, treaties, peace. Words give meaning to the silence between us. And yes, sometimes words fail. But they must be tried first, spoken with honesty, or we are nothing but animals fighting over territory." She paused, then continued softer. You took hostages to make someone listen. I understand. But these people, the elders, the children, they are not your enemy. They are what you're fighting to protect. Let them go, and I promise you will still be heard. Then your soldiers will kill me. No, Sarah said firmly. You have my word. You will have safe passage to meet with tribal council. You will speak. And if you choose to walk away from violence after that, you will be helped to do so. One woman's promise means nothing. Then ask Rashid, Sarah said, raising her voice slightly. Ask the elder who shelters you. Ask him if I honor my word. Movement behind a window. Then Rashid emerged, hands bound but eyes clear. She speaks truth, Rashid said in Arabic. She is different from the others. She sees us. Karim's weapon lowered slightly. Why? He asked Sarah. Why do you care? Because I believe every person deserves to be heard in their own language, Sarah said. Because I believe that before we are enemies, we are human beings. Because I have sat where you sit, invisible and unheard, and I know what that silence does to the soul. Her voice carried across the square, not just to Karim, but to every fighter present. She switched between dialects, speaking so each could hear her in the language of their childhood. Their mothers, their hearts. You are not invisible, she said. You are not forgotten. Today you have a choice. Continue on a path where your voice becomes another casualty. Or take the harder road, the brave road, and speak without weapons. Show your true strength. The sun climbed higher. Time stretched. Every breath felt weighted with possibility. Then Karim stood slowly. He looked at his fighters, then back at Sarah. We surrender, he said quietly. But only to you. Only to the woman who listened. One by one, weapons were laid down. Not thrown in defeat, but placed carefully, a gesture of choice, not compulsion. The hostages were released. Rashid embraced his grandchildren. Tears flowed freely. Back at the base, soldiers watched in disbelief as the situation resolved without a single shot fired. When Sarah returned hours later, escorting Karim and his men for the promised dialogue, the base stood at attention. Not for a general. Not for a hero in the traditional sense. For a translator who had proven that the most powerful weapon is understanding. Hawthorne met her at the gate. Lieutenant Chen, he said formally, then his voice softened. Sarah, you did what an entire battalion couldn't do. I did what I was trained to do, Sarah replied. I listened, spoke. I built a bridge. That evening, as Sarah sat in her quarters writing her report, a knock came at her door. Brooks stood there, looking uncomfortable. I owe you an apology, he said. I thought translators were just support staff. I didn't understand. Most people don't, Sarah said gently. But maybe now, when someone speaks quietly, when someone seems invisible, you'll remember that the most important voices aren't always the loudest. Sometimes they're the ones that understand both sides of the silence. News of the peaceful resolution spread. The military recognized Sarah's actions with commendations. But more importantly, attitudes shifted. Translators, linguists, cultural advisors, the invisible soldiers began to be seen. Sarah continued her work, still often overlooked, still moving in the spaces between notice and recognition. But now when she spoke, people listened. Because they had learned what she always knew, that words spoken with truth and compassion can achieve what force cannot, that understanding another person's language means seeing their humanity, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is not to raise your weapon, but to raise your voice in the language of peace. Karim eventually became a community mediator, using his voice to prevent others from choosing violence. The young fighters who surrendered found new paths, new purposes. And somewhere in a operations center, a new generation of soldiers learned Sarah's most important lesson. Because in the end, we are all just seeking to be heard. And sometimes, the person who gives voice to that need changes everything. Not with a weapon, with words that bridge the distance between us,